To close out 2025 on a strong note, my tasting group recently got together and we did a comparison tasting of all 5 First Growths from the tremendous 1996 vintage. Since there were 6 of us, we also included the Leoville Las Cases. We tasted these wines single blind, so we knew which wines were in the lineup, but we did not know which was which. Our objective was to identify not only our favorite wine in the lineup, but also try to identify which of these wines was which. In this video, I'll start out by briefly discussing the 1996 vintage on Bordeaux's left bank. After that, I'll talk about the style for each of these wines and what I was looking for when I was trying to identify them in the blind tasting. Then, I'll discuss my observations or takeaways for wine collectors from this comparison tasting. Before getting into the individual wines, it's important to have some context regarding the 1996 vintage. 1996 was a classic vintage on Bordeaux's left bank. There was a long growing season that allowed the late ripening Cabernet Sauvignon to fully ripen, and there were cool nights late into the growing season that helped to preserve acidity and freshness in the grapes. The best wines from 1996 on Bordeaux's left bank have clarity, energy, balance, and length. They're not just about power. In my opinion, I think 1996 is the second best vintage in the 90s on Bordeaux's left bank, after only 1990. While 1995 also gets some high marks, I still find that the tannins from the 1995 wines on Bordeaux's left bank can be a bit drying, and those wines are definitely a little bit more austere than the 1996s, which can definitely be a little bit more generous with riper, more integrated tannins. Having said that, many of the top wines from 1996 have aged extremely slowly. Nevertheless, we did a tasting like this one for the 1990 vintage maybe 5 or 6 years ago, so everyone thought it was a great idea to do it again for 1996. This is especially true since a couple top critics, namely Jan Anson and also Wine Advocate, have rescored some of these wines in the past few years, and at least 4 of them have received 100-point scores since 2022. With that, I'm ready to discuss the tasting. There were 6 of us who participated. The person who contributed the Leoville Las Cases, which is less expensive than the First Growths, also kicked in a starter champagne for us to enjoy. The wines were decanted about 90 minutes before the tasting and poured into the glass about 15 minutes before we started. Recently, one of my earliest subscribers and most loyal viewers requested that I provide some information regarding the style of each of the First Growths, such as which of them is the most elegant, which is the most powerful, and some information about which of them you could enjoy younger, and so forth. So I'm going to start out by briefly discussing the style for each of these wines and what I was looking for when I was tasting these wines blind to try to identify which of them was which. We'll start out with Chateau Lafite Rothschild. With Lafite, it's all about elegance, not about power. While it's intense and concentrated, it's never heavy or aggressive. On the palate, it's extremely effortless. The aromatics are extremely refined. You can expect black currant, cedar, graphite, and sometimes a subtle floral note. There's incredible balance, and it's a very harmonious wine. Nothing is out of place, and there's no rough edges. It's oftentimes extremely understated. For that reason, it can be difficult to identify in a blind tasting, but I've found that in many of these blind tastings, a lot of people identify Lafite as their favorite. This was one of the wines that's been recently scored and received a 100-point score. In addition, Lafite tends to be either the most expensive or certainly one of the most expensive of the First Growths, although that can vary a little bit by vintage. This particular wine is selling for right around $1,000 to $1,200 per bottle, depending on the supplier. But for this wine, and for all other wines, you'll definitely want to shop around, as prices can vary wildly. Next up is Chateau Latour, and unlike Lafite, Latour is very much all about power. I'm looking for serious structure, density, and grit. On the palate, Latour often feels coiled and massive, with tannins suggesting decades of life ahead of it. In my opinion, Latour is also a little bit more brooding, leaner, and less vibrant and expressive in terms of fruit than some of the other first growths. While there is some black currant oftentimes, it tends to be a little bit more reticent and less expressive than the black currant in the fruit on some of the other wines. In addition, I oftentimes find a prominent gravel descriptor, sometimes some iron, and a little bit of smoke as well. Out of all the first growths, Latour is absolutely also the wine that I expect to take the longest to reach peak, and the one that is definitely the most powerful. The 1996 Latour received a perfect 100-point score from Wine Advocate recently, and this is a wine that also sells for around $1,100 per bottle. Latour can also be one of the more expensive first growths. When I'm looking to identify Chateau Margaux in a blind tasting like this one, I start out by looking for elegance, because like Lafite, Margaux is definitely one of the most elegant first growths. However, the way I distinguish Margaux is oftentimes with its vibrant and pronounced aromatic profile. With Margaux, I tend to look for floral notes such as violets, and there can also be a little bit more of a red fruit profile and a little bit more aromatic lift generally. But certainly it's extraordinarily elegant on the palate as well. The texture is incredibly refined. Margaux is a wine that tends to be seamless, graceful, and harmonious. It's another wine that's all about elegance and not so much about power. Having said that, in strong vintages, it's absolutely a wine that's very intense and concentrated as well. This is another wine that sells for around $1,100 or $1,200 and which received a 100-point score from Jane Anson when she scored it back in 2022. Haut-Brion oftentimes stands apart from the Medoc first growths as it's located in Pessac-Léognan, and it tends to be the most distinctive and unique of the first growths and the one that's easiest to identify blind in a tasting like this one. Haut-Brion tends to have the highest percentage of Merlot of any of the first growths, so that's definitely something that I take into account when I'm trying to identify it in a blind tasting. With Haut-Brion, I'm also looking for flavors and aromas that are a little bit more savory and less fruity. Specifically, I'll look for descriptors such as gravel, earth, smoke, tobacco, ash, leather, dried spice, and the like. Haut-Brion can also have a little bit of a distinctive weight on the mid-palate that sometimes allows me to identify it. On the bright side, Haut-Brion can be one of the least expensive of the first growths, and that's certainly true with respect to the 1996 vintage, which is selling for around $575 to $650 per bottle. Mouton Rothschild tends to be one of the more flashy, flamboyant first growths. With this wine, I'm looking for ripe black currant, exotic spices, and a sense of generosity. Compared to its Pauillac brethren, Lafite and Latour, it's definitely the most immediately expressive with a plush texture. In a blind tasting like this one, it's oftentimes one of the more approachable wines, even if it still has substantial structure. Mouton is definitely an extremely age-worthy wine, but because of its approachability, it's one that I've found that you can enjoy on the younger side in certain riper vintages. As with Haut-Brion, this one tends to be one of the more affordable first growths, and I found this one selling for around $600 to $700 per bottle. While Leoville Las Cases is a second growth in the 1855 classification of Bordeaux, many of my viewers commented in my reclassification of Bordeaux video that they think that Las Cases should be elevated to first growth. Leoville Las Cases is neighbors with Chateau Latour, and in many ways, stylistically, it has some similarities to Latour, although it's not quite as powerful as Latour. So with Las Cases, I'm again looking for a more reticent, restrained fruit profile, serious structure, and a more disciplined profile. It can be austere in its youth, and it's oftentimes one of the slowest of the wines to evolve. This is also the least expensive of the wines in the lineup, and it sells for between $300 and $400 per bottle, but Jane Anson also gave this wine a perfect 100-point score in June of 2024. Hopefully that stylistic overview of the first growths and Leoville Las Cases was useful for you. With that by way of background, I'm ready to reveal my observations or takeaways from this first growth tasting. To start, it was an extreme relief that all of the wines were showing well and that there were no obvious flaws or bottle variation with the wines. With wines 3 decades old, you never know if you might have one or two of them that can be a little bit off, and that can definitely be a big downer, particularly in tastings like this one, where you're hoping to have one representative of each of the first growths included in the tasting. Each of these wines came from the cellar of one of the participants, and there were no spare or extra bottles. So if one of them was off, we would have simply had to go without that particular wine. One thing that surprised us a bit and which stood out immediately was just how youthful these wines were. Even after substantial aeration, these wines still kept evolving over the course of the night and were incredibly youthful. In fact, I would have to say that I don't think any of them are at their peak yet. They're extremely well balanced, harmonious, and enjoyable, but they definitely have room for additional tertiary development. I would say that probably Lafite, Margaux, and Haut-Brion are the closest to their peak and are definitely extremely enjoyable wines that you could enjoy now. There's certainly no rush, however, and I do think that they still have room to improve, and the others certainly do as well. Another important takeaway from this blind tasting is that it was extremely difficult to identify each of these wines blind. This was so despite the fact that each of the tasting participants were very experienced wine collectors who had lots of experience tasting First Growth Bordeaux. In fact, 5 of the tasters were also involved in the similar 1990 First Growth tasting that we did a few years ago, and in that tasting there were several people who actually identified correctly all 5 of the First Growths in the lineup. This time, however, many of the tasters got only one of the wines correct. Everyone was able to identify the Latour, as that one was extremely powerful and easy to spot. But after that, it became very difficult. I also identified Mouton, which is the wine that I brought, and Las Cases. Given how difficult it was to identify the wines, it should be no surprise that it was also extremely difficult to name a favorite. After a lot of deliberation, I ultimately identified 2 wines that were standouts, and those wines ended up being Lafite and Margaux. When I had to pick just one of them, I ended up going with Lafite, but they were extremely close. That said, along with Latour, Lafite and Margaux are absolutely 2 of the more expensive wines out of these 6 as well. And given how close the wines were in terms of quality, it's important to keep that in mind when you're making purchasing decisions regarding these wines. For example, you can get 2 bottles of Haut-Brion or 3 bottles of Las Cases for the price of 1 bottle of Latour, Lafite, or Margaux. As much as I enjoyed the Leoville Las Cases, for me it finished 6th out of this impressive lineup, primarily because it had slightly less intensity and concentration than the First Growths. Interestingly, we had this wine several months ago as well, and we didn't notice it at the time. But when tasting Las Cases directly in head-to-head comparison with the other First Growths, that distinction became more apparent. I should also mention that while it was extremely insightful and informative comparing these wines side by side, it's not at all how most people experience them, and I would be delighted to enjoy any of these wines any day of the week. On most nights, any of them would be a front runner for wine of the night. They're that impressive. If I were to rate these wines just in terms of my evaluation and scores, I would probably go with Lafite, Margaux, Latour, Mouton, Haut-Brion, and Las Cases. Latour was extremely powerful and impressive. It's just very, very youthful, and that's why I didn't rate it higher. This is a wine that probably needs at least another 10 years before it will reach peak. The Haut-Brion was extremely enjoyable as well. It was the most distinct aromatically. It had this menthol quality that definitely set it apart from the rest of the lineup. If you'd like to learn more about First Growth Bordeaux, I've done dedicated standalone videos about each of the First Growth Bordeaux producers. To watch them, be sure to check out this playlist that's linked above.